Look closer. What you call the void, I call the beginning.
Picture a young academic walking through the stacks of a philosophy library, surrounded by centuries of human thought, seeking meaning and purpose. This is Eugene Thacker, in his early 20s, not yet the radical pessimist who would challenge everything we think we know about philosophy's relationship to horror. Since his birth, Thacker found himself increasingly drawn to questions that traditional philosophy seemed unable to answer. Not why the world has meaning, but what happens when we are forced to confront the possibility that it doesn't. Eugene Thacker was not just another academic philosopher. He was a prophet who anticipated the greatest crises of our time: ecological collapse, technological alienation, and the creeping sense that human consciousness might be cosmically insignificant. Why do we suffer not just as individuals, but as a species caught in processes beyond our control? What happens when our greatest achievements reveal our fundamental powerlessness? Can philosophy help us face a world that seems designed to mock human aspiration? What makes Thacker unique is his refusal to offer easy consolations or the promise of eventual triumph. He looked directly at the darkest aspects of existence and found not despair, but a profound philosophical clarity. What you're about to hear is every major philosophical idea this genius ever developed. Not surface-level summaries, but deep exploration of the concepts that changed how humanity thinks about our place in an indifferent cosmos. Welcome to Sleepy Philosopher, where we explore the most profound ideas in human history, slowly enough to truly understand them. Complex philosophy delivered at a pace that lets these concepts sink in. If this approach to philosophy resonates with you, consider subscribing, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let us begin our journey into cosmic pessimism. Cosmic pessimism stands as Thacker's defining contribution to contemporary philosophy, because it completely reframes pessimism not as emotional despair or psychological pathology, but as philosophical clarity about humanity's true position before an indifferent cosmos. Through his engagement with Arthur Schopenhauer's metaphysical pessimism, Thomas Ligotti's literary philosophy of cosmic horror, and medieval mystical traditions, Thacker developed a systematic approach that recognizes the fundamental mismatch between human meaning-making and the world's impersonal processes. This insight emerged not from personal suffering or nihilistic conviction, but from rigorous philosophical analysis of the limits of human knowledge and the structural constraints that prevent us from accessing ultimate reality. The significance of cosmic pessimism lies in its ability to provide a rational framework for experiences that otherwise seem irrational or pathological, transforming existential anxiety into philosophical insight. The theoretical framework of cosmic pessimism is built upon what Thacker calls world without us, the recognition that reality exists independently of human perception, conceptual schemes, and meaning-making processes. Unlike traditional philosophical problems that assume the possibility of eventual resolution or understanding, cosmic pessimism foregrounds the structural inability of human cognition to fully comprehend the systems in which we are embedded. This framework draws from phenomenological analysis of experiences where human conceptual categories break down, revealing the artificial nature of our ordinary sense of meaning and purpose. Thacker argues that philosophical traditions have consistently underestimated the degree to which human consciousness operates within narrow parameters that cannot encompass the full scope of cosmic processes. The framework therefore emphasizes philosophical humility over mastery, recognizing the inherent limitations of anthropocentric thinking, while still maintaining the possibility of gaining insight into these very limitations. Cosmic pessimism operates through specific mechanisms that Thacker identifies as philosophical experiences, moments where ordinary meaning-making encounters its own limits and collapses under the weight of cosmic indifference. These mechanisms manifest in experiences of what he terms world failure, where familiar frameworks for understanding suddenly reveal themselves as inadequate to the realities they purport to describe. The operational pattern involves an initial sense of stability and meaning, followed by a gradual recognition that this stability depends upon conditions that exceed human control or understanding. More specifically, cosmic pessimism functions through what Thacker calls counterintuitive cognition, the deliberate cultivation of doubt about our most fundamental assumptions regarding meaning, purpose, and human centrality. This process operates not through argument alone, but through experiences that force consciousness to confront its own limitations, leading to what Thacker describes as philosophical despair, that paradoxically becomes the starting point for genuine wisdom. In contemporary culture, cosmic pessimism provides essential frameworks for understanding phenomena that traditional philosophical approaches have failed to address adequately. The widespread ecological anxiety surrounding climate change reflects what Thacker would recognize as an intuitive recognition of our cosmic insignificance. We are literally small creatures caught in planetary processes that operate on timescales and scales that dwarf human lifespans. Technological alienation similarly manifests the mechanisms of cosmic pessimism, as our most advanced systems operate through algorithmic processes that remain incomprehensible to their creators, while simultaneously reshaping human consciousness. The current cultural fascination with horror narratives, from cosmic horror to body horror, represents attempts to process experiences that resist rational explanation. These genres succeed precisely because they tap into the philosophical experiences that cosmic pessimism systematizes, encounters with forces that exceed human comprehension, systems that operate independently of human will, and realities that function according to logics alien to human meaning-making. Understanding cosmic pessimism reveals these contemporary phenomena not as pathology or temporary cultural fads, but as rational responses to genuine philosophical problems. Understanding cosmic pessimism provides the essential philosophical groundwork for Thacker's entire theoretical system, establishing how his later analyses of horror as philosophy depend upon this initial destabilization of human-centered thinking. This concept transforms the relationship between philosophy and negative experiences, showing how what appears to be despair or nihilism can actually serve as a foundation for genuine philosophical insight. The integrative implications extend beyond Thacker's individual system to offer a framework for contemporary philosophy that takes seriously the limits of human knowledge while maintaining the possibility of meaningful philosophical inquiry. As we will explore in subsequent sections, cosmic pessimism enables Thacker's development of horror philosophy by providing the necessary philosophical humility that prevents anthropocentric assumptions from corrupting philosophical analysis. This foundation allows for a systematic exploration of how horror functions not as entertainment or pathology, but as a legitimate philosophical methodology for approaching questions that exceed human conceptual capacities. Thacker's tripartite distinction between the world for us, the world in itself, and the world without us represents the foundational architecture of his entire philosophical horror project, establishing the analytical framework through which all subsequent concepts will be understood. This systematic separation of different modes of world relation becomes crucial because it demonstrates how horror emerges specifically from the collapse of human-centered meaning when confronted with scales and processes that exceed conceptual grasp. The distinction operates by mapping different types of philosophical and experiential engagement with reality, creating what Thacker calls the tripartite horror grid that allows systematic analysis of where human meaning breaks down and what remains when anthropocentric assumptions are suspended. The theoretical framework begins with the world for us, which Thacker defines as human-centered reality, filtered through language, culture, and everyday practical concerns, representing the realm where meaning operates and purposes can be assigned to events. The world in itself constitutes Kant's noumenal reality beyond all possible human experience, the philosophical abstraction that represents pure being in itself without the mediating structures of human cognition or representation. Most importantly, the world without us emerges as Thacker's unique contribution, representing reality as it would exist in the absence of human consciousness altogether, where neither meaning nor representation applies, since there is no one to experience or interpret these processes. This third category represents the horror horizon, where human categories fail completely, revealing existence as indifferent, inaccessible, and fundamentally unconcerned with human flourishing or understanding. These operational mechanisms become visible through what Thacker analyzes as catastrophic ruptures in the world for us, where natural disasters, pandemics, or technological singularities suddenly expose the inadequacy of human conceptual frameworks when confronted with processes operating beyond human scale or agency. The mechanism functions by comparing ordinary experience, where the world for us provides comprehensible context for daily activities, with moments when events occur that cannot be integrated into existing meaning structures, forcing recognition that human categories represent temporary arrangements rather than eternal truths. When the world in itself becomes momentarily visible through these ruptures, it appears as philosophical abstraction stripped of all anthropomorphic projections, while the world without us reveals itself as the ultimate horizon where all human concerns ultimately become irrelevant in the face of cosmic indifference. Contemporary applications of this framework become apparent in current discussions of climate change, where weather patterns reveal forces operating on geological timescales that completely exceed human planning horizons, demonstrating how environmental catastrophe exposes the world without us as reality stripped of anthropocentric assumptions about progress or mastery. Global pandemics operate similarly, revealing biological processes that operate according to evolutionary logic, completely indifferent to human social structures or economic concerns, while emerging artificial intelligence systems create algorithmic landscapes whose decision-making processes exceed human comprehension yet determine crucial aspects of daily life. These phenomena demonstrate Thacker's insight that horror emerges not from supernatural threats, but from recognition that human meaning operates within temporary conceptual arrangements that could be disrupted at any moment by forces operating beyond human control or understanding. Understanding these distinctions reveals how Thacker constructs his entire philosophical system around the shifting relationships between human consciousness and the non-human cosmos, showing that horror becomes not a pathology to be overcome, but an accurate recognition of humanity's actual situation within larger existential frameworks. This tripartite analysis provides the systematic foundation for all subsequent explorations of cosmic pessimism, demonstrating how human-centered meaning represents one possible mode of world relation among several others that may prove equally or more fundamental to understanding existence. The framework establishes that philosophical horror emerges specifically from recognition of these different world modalities and their implications for human thought, purpose, and flourishing within a cosmos that operates according to principles fundamentally incompatible with anthropocentric assumptions. Negative theology emerges as one of Thacker's most crucial intellectual tools for confronting what he calls the unrepresentable dimensions of existence. While his earlier exploration of cosmic pessimism revealed human insignificance in a vast, indifferent universe, negative theology provides the philosophical vocabulary necessary to think about those very aspects of reality that resist human comprehension. Thacker discovered that traditional affirmative approaches to understanding, where we seek to define and categorize, prove inadequate when confronting the horror of existence itself. This methodological breakthrough emerged from his engagement with medieval mystical traditions, particularly the work of Pseudo-Dionysius and Meister Eckhart, whose apophatic approaches emphasized divine unknowability. However, Thacker repurposes this medieval framework for entirely different purposes, using it to contemplate not divine presence, but cosmic absence, not spiritual fulfillment, but existential horror. The theoretical framework of negative theology centers on what Thacker terms linguistic failure, as a philosophical methodology rather than a limitation to be overcome. Unlike positive theology, which seeks to affirm divine attributes and characteristics, negative theology operates through systematic negation. God is not this, God is not that, eventually reaching a point where language itself breaks down in the face of ultimate reality. Thacker extends this approach beyond divine matters to encompass what he calls the world in itself, the underlying reality that exists regardless of human perception or interpretation. The key insight involves recognizing that language's inability to capture certain realities doesn't represent philosophical failure, but rather reveals something profound about the nature of existence itself. This approach treats conceptual breakdown not as weakness, but as a reliable indicator of having encountered something that genuinely exceeds human cognitive and linguistic capacities. The operational mechanisms of negative theology function through what Thacker identifies as philosophical unworking, a deliberate process of stripping away inadequate concepts and representations until reaching the point where language fails. This process unfolds through systematic engagement with various domains of human knowledge and experience, each revealing different aspects of their own fundamental limitations. When encountering overwhelming ecological data about species extinction rates, for example, traditional frameworks of environmentalism prove inadequate, forcing acknowledgement that human meanings and values cannot adequately address geological-scale processes. Similarly, when artificial intelligence systems generate outputs that exceed human interpretive capacities, rather than simply dismissing this as technical limitation, negative theology treats such failures as evidence of encountering unhuman modes of operation. The methodology involves purposely pushing concepts to their breaking point, then documenting the resulting breakdown as philosophically significant data about the limits of human understanding. Contemporary applications of negative theology illuminate scientific frontiers where established explanatory frameworks prove inadequate for understanding emerging phenomena. In quantum physics, measurements that fundamentally alter the systems being observed or particles existing in superposition until observation forces collapse into definite states represent precisely the kind of reality that resists traditional categorical thinking. Astrophysics similarly confronts researchers with phenomena like dark matter and dark energy, which constitute the vast majority of the universe yet remain undetectable through conventional observational methods. These scientific developments require approaches that can accommodate fundamental unknowability rather than treating it as temporary limitation to be overcome through better instrumentation. Climate science encounters similar challenges when modeling complex atmospheric systems, where small variables can produce disproportionate effects. creating predictive limitations that reflect not insufficient data, but inherent unpredictability within complex systems. Negative theology provides philosophical scaffolding for accepting these fundamental limitations as integral features of reality rather than obstacles to eventual mastery. The integrative implications of negative theology reveal Thacker's sophisticated synthesis of medieval mystical thought with contemporary philosophical horror, creating a methodological framework that bridges traditional religious contemplation and modern secular understanding. This synthesis demonstrates how ancient approaches to divine unknowability can be repurposed for contemplating cosmic insignificance and existential horror, suggesting continuity between medieval mysticism and contemporary pessimism. By establishing linguistic failure as a reliable indicator of having encountered genuine philosophical depth, negative theology provides Thacker with systematic means for distinguishing between manageable problems and fundamental horror, those aspects of existence that resist human meaning-making entirely. This methodological breakthrough enables him to develop what he terms philosophical horror as legitimate intellectual pursuit, transforming what might appear as mere literary or cultural fascination into rigorous philosophical inquiry about the deepest structures of reality itself. Thacker's most revolutionary philosophical move lies in his counterintuitive proposition that horror functions not merely as cultural expression, but as a genuine method for philosophical inquiry. This repositioning transforms horror from dismissed entertainment into a sophisticated tool for exploring the most fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, and human existence. Rather than viewing horror as primitive emotional response or commercial spectacle, Thacker recognizes horror narratives as philosophical laboratories where abstract metaphysical problems become experientially accessible through allegory and effect. This methodological shift allows philosophy to bypass the limitations of purely rational discourse and engage directly with the emotional and psychological dimensions of existential encounter. By establishing horror as legitimate philosophical method, Thacker creates space for thinking about cosmic insignificance and metaphysical absence through narrative forms that traditional philosophy cannot access. The theoretical framework of horror as method rests on Thacker's observation that horror consistently employs recurring archetypal figures and scenarios that function as philosophical allegories. Monsters represent the encounter with radical otherness that defies human categories of understanding, while plague narratives explore how biological systems operate according to principles indifferent to human welfare and social organization. Void horror manifests the philosophical problem of absolute absence and the limits of representation, where attempts to conceptualize nothingness reveal the inadequacies of human cognitive frameworks. These horror motifs don't simply entertain, but provide systematic approaches to metaphysical problems that resist conventional philosophical treatment. Thacker argues that horror's power lies in its ability to make presentable the fundamentally unpresentable, those aspects of existence that exceed human comprehension yet demand philosophical attention through indirect means. The operational mechanisms of horror as method function through carefully orchestrated collapses of familiar reality that expose the contingency underlying everyday assumptions. Horror narratives initiate this process by introducing elements that cannot be integrated into existing worldview frameworks, creating cognitive dissonance that forces reconsideration of basic assumptions about reality and meaning. These collapse moments, such as encountering an entity that violates natural laws, experiencing technological systems that operate according to incomprehensible logic, or confronting environmental changes that exceed human adaptation capacities, function as philosophical demonstrations of theoretical concepts. The method operates by first establishing comfortable familiarity with conventional reality, then systematically undermining those foundations through increasingly destabilizing elements that reveal the arbitrary nature of human-made meaning systems. This methodical deconstruction reveals how much of what we consider permanent and meaningful depends upon unexamined assumptions about cosmic order and human centrality. Contemporary applications of horror as method demonstrate remarkable explanatory power for understanding current cultural phenomena and existential anxieties. Climate change narratives in fiction and film operate as horror methodologies, making present the abstract concept of geological timescales through visceral depictions of ecological collapse that exceed human planning horizons. The recent global pandemic provided lived experience of horror as method, as familiar social and economic structures proved inadequate when confronted with viral processes operating according to biological logic rather than human convenience. Artificial intelligence representations in contemporary media function similarly, using horror narratives to explore decision-making systems whose internal operations exceed human comprehension, thereby demonstrating the methodological value of horror for thinking about technological transcendence. Even political discourse increasingly employs horror imagery when confronting systemic problems that resist rational resolution, suggesting the intuitive recognition of horror's methodological power even outside formal philosophical contexts. The integrative implications of horror as method reveal Thacker's systematic approach to constructing his entire philosophical framework through narrative and affective experience rather than traditional abstract argumentation. This methodological choice allows him to address metaphysical problems that conventional philosophy approaches through increasingly complex theoretical constructions. Instead, engaging these problems through stories that make the philosophical stakes experientially clear. The method proves particularly powerful for exploring cosmic pessimism, because horror narratives naturally embody the encounter with scale disparities that render human concerns simultaneously significant and insignificant. By establishing horror as legitimate philosophical method, Thacker creates a systematic approach to negative theology that operates through literary and cultural forms rather than purely conceptual analysis. This methodological innovation provides foundation for all subsequent developments in his philosophy, from the distinction between world without us and world in itself to applications in contemporary cultural criticism and ethical theory, demonstrating how apparently peripheral cultural phenomena can serve as central philosophical resources. The concept of the unhuman represents one of Thacker's most crucial philosophical contributions, designating forces that operate neither within human categories nor simply as external natural phenomena, but as radically indifferent presences that cannot be incorporated into any framework of human meaning. This category emerges from Thacker's sustained engagement with cosmic pessimism and horror as philosophical method, revealing how certain encounters with reality expose the fundamental limitations of anthropocentric thinking. The unhuman arises most dramatically in catastrophic events and natural processes that function according to scales and logics entirely beyond human comprehension or control, forcing us to confront the possibility that existence itself may be fundamentally inhospitable to human meaning-making. Understanding this concept is essential for grasping the full scope of Thacker's philosophical project, as it provides the conceptual vocabulary for discussing those aspects of reality that resist all forms of human conceptualization. Thacker defines the unhuman through a precise theoretical framework that distinguishes it from both human consciousness and merely non-human natural processes, positioning it as a category of radical otherness that actively resists incorporation into human meaning structures. Unlike the natural world that can be studied, manipulated, or integrated into human projects, the unhuman functions as that which remains perpetually exterior to all human attempts at comprehension and control. The unhuman operates by dissolving the conceptual boundaries that normally organize human experience, particularly the fundamental distinctions between life and death, presence and absence, subject and object, self and world. This dissolution creates what Thacker calls a crisis of conceptual stability, where normal frameworks of meaning prove inadequate for processing encounters with forces that operate according to completely alien principles. The theoretical structure of the unhuman reveals how horror functions as a philosophical method for approaching those aspects of reality that exceed the scope of human understanding. The operational mechanisms of the unhuman become visible through processes that dissolve established conceptual boundaries and render normal meaning-making systems ineffective, creating experiences where familiar categories suddenly prove inadequate for processing what is being encountered. These mechanisms manifest when natural or technological systems begin operating according to patterns that cannot be interpreted through existing frameworks, producing what Thacker describes as meaning collapse, where the normal relationship between signifiers and signified breaks down completely. The unhuman emerges most vividly in processes that appear to function according to their own autonomous logic, whether in the behavior of complex ecological systems, the emergence of algorithmic patterns that exceed their programming parameters, or the manifestation of biological processes that seem to operate independently of conscious control. These mechanisms reveal themselves through experiences of what Thacker calls conceptual vertigo, where the fundamental categories through which we organize experience suddenly become unstable or unreliable, forcing confrontations with reality that cannot be processed through normal cognitive or cultural frameworks. Contemporary encounters with unhuman dynamics appear most clearly in current debates surrounding artificial intelligence systems that develop decision-making processes exceeding their original programming parameters, creating technological situations where outputs emerge that human observers cannot meaningfully interpret or predict. Bioengineering innovations that enable manipulation of fundamental biological processes often encounter unexpected behaviors as manipulated organisms begin functioning according to patterns that exceed human understanding of biological systems, creating scenarios where scientific control proves inadequate. Climate science increasingly documents phenomena where environmental systems begin manifesting behaviors that exceed predictive models, creating situations where normally reliable scientific frameworks prove inadequate for understanding or responding to environmental changes. These contemporary applications of unhuman dynamics reveal how the theoretical framework, developed through philosophical horror analysis, provides essential vocabulary for understanding aspects of modern technological and scientific experience that resist traditional frameworks of meaning-making and control, showing how Thacker's pessimistic philosophical framework offers crucial insights into the contemporary relationship between human systems and reality. Grasping the concept of the unhuman provides the crucial metaphysical horizon that completes Thacker's philosophical framework, offering a systematic vocabulary for discussing those aspects of existence that fundamentally resist incorporation into human meaning systems, while revealing the limitations inherent in anthropocentric approaches to understanding reality. The unhuman functions as the conceptual bridge connecting Thacker's earlier insights about cosmic pessimism and world without us to concrete encounters with forces that operate beyond human scale and comprehension, demonstrating how horror serves as a doorway into confronting radical otherness rather than simply as aesthetic experience. This understanding establishes the foundation for approaching questions of ethics, politics, and culture from a perspective that acknowledges the fundamental limits of human frameworks, while neither retreating into nihilistic despair nor clinging to comforting illusions about human centrality. The unhuman becomes not merely a theoretical category, but a practical framework for navigating encounters with reality that exceed normal human meaning-making capacities, offering philosophical resources for understanding how horror can serve as legitimate methodology for approaching fundamental questions about existence, knowledge, and the relationship between human consciousness and reality. Catastrophe functions as one of the most powerful mechanisms in Thacker's philosophical arsenal for revealing the world without us that he has described throughout his system of cosmic pessimism. While we have explored his foundational concepts of horror as philosophical method and the unhuman forces that operate beyond human comprehension, catastrophe represents the moment when these abstract philosophical principles become viscerally undeniable through events that overwhelm human conceptual capacities. Thacker argues that catastrophe strips away the protective illusions of human-centered meaning-making, forcing direct confrontation with realities that typically remain hidden behind the reassuring structures of language, technology, and social organization. This understanding transforms catastrophe from mere destructive event into a revelation of the cosmic conditions that define human existence within a fundamentally inhospitable universe. Thacker defines catastrophe as any event, whether natural disaster, technological failure, biological pandemic, or existential crisis, that produces an epistemological rupture in human understanding, creating what he calls a moment of world failure, where previously reliable conceptual frameworks suddenly prove inadequate. This rupture occurs when events exceed the explanatory and interpretive capacities of the human mind, forcing individuals and societies to confront the limitations of their knowledge systems when faced with realities operating according to scales, timelines, and logics that transcend human comprehension. The catastrophe functions as what Thacker terms an apophatic event, revealing truth through negation, showing us what reality is not by stripping away our anthropocentric assumptions about how the world should function. This revelation occurs not through positive knowledge acquisition, but through the forced recognition of the limits of human knowing when confronted with forces that operate according to principles completely beyond human control or understanding. The operational mechanism of catastrophe operates through what Thacker describes as a systematic stripping away of protective human-centered assumptions that normally mask the world without us. When catastrophe strikes, the familiar social, technological, and linguistic structures that normally create the illusion of human mastery over reality suddenly prove inadequate, revealing the underlying cosmic conditions that operate independently of human meaning-making. The catastrophe forces what Thacker calls an encounter with pure facticity, events that simply exist without reference to human purposes, values, or interpretations. This encounter produces what he terms philosophical horror, not simply psychological distress, but the specific recognition that reality contains aspects that fundamentally resist human comprehension and control. The mechanism works by overwhelming normal cognitive processes and forcing what might be called catastrophic thinking, the recognition that human knowledge systems are temporary constructs that can be shattered by events operating according to non-human principles. Contemporary examples of catastrophe as revelation manifest across multiple domains of modern existence. Financial market crashes that propagate through algorithmic trading systems operating beyond human interpretation reveal the fragility of economic structures when faced with computational processes that develop their own emergent logics. Solar storms that could disrupt global communication networks expose humanity's dependence on technological systems that remain vulnerable to cosmic forces operating on scales that transcend human planning horizons. Biological weaponization of diseases demonstrates how scientific knowledge can produce catastrophes that exceed the original intentions of researchers, creating processes that function according to viral evolution rather than human ethical frameworks. Network infrastructure failures during extreme weather events reveal how seemingly robust technological systems remain dependent on environmental conditions that operate according to geological rather than technological timescales. Space debris accumulation threatening satellite operations exemplifies how human technological achievements can produce cascades of failure that operate according to orbital mechanics rather than human administrative structures. Understanding catastrophe as revelation illuminates how disruption functions as a primary mechanism for accessing deeper philosophical truths about human existence within Thacker's framework of cosmic pessimism. This concept synthesizes his earlier insights about horror as philosophical method and the world without us by demonstrating how catastrophic events create the conditions for authentic philosophical engagement with cosmic reality rather than merely human projections onto that reality. The catastrophic moment forces what Thacker considers genuine philosophical thinking, the recognition of human limitations when confronted with forces operating according to non-human principles. This understanding provides the foundation for the more advanced applications we will explore in subsequent segments. As catastrophe becomes the method through which Thacker's cosmic pessimism moves from abstract philosophical position to lived encounter with the fundamental conditions that define human existence within an ultimately inhospitable universe. For Eugene Thacker, monsters represent far more than creatures of horror fiction. They function as metaphysical symbols that expose the fundamental tension between human attempts to understand reality and the cosmic indifference that characterizes existence beyond human meaning. Building upon his earlier exploration of cosmic pessimism and the limitations of human knowledge systems, Thacker identifies monsters as particularly powerful philosophical tools because they embody what he calls the unthinkable, those aspects of reality that resist classification within human conceptual frameworks. These figures operate at the boundaries where human comprehension breaks down, forcing confrontations with the limitations of our knowledge systems and the fragility of our attempts to impose meaning upon an ultimately meaningless universe. Thacker defines monsters as ontological paradoxes that occupy a space between categories, neither entirely natural nor supernatural, neither fully comprehensible nor completely alien, but existing in a state of conceptual liminality that destabilizes established systems of classification. Drawing from his understanding of negative theology and the limits of knowing that we explored earlier, monsters function as negative demonstrations of what cannot be thought, felt, or understood within human consciousness. They represent the failure of human language and logic to fully capture the complexity of existence, operating as symbols of the world without us that Thacker identified in his foundational work. Through their very existence, monsters reveal the inadequacy of binary oppositions that structure human thought, forcing recognition of the vast realm of experience that lies beyond our conceptual grasp. The operational mechanisms of monsters as philosophical symbols operate through what Thacker characterizes as ontological destabilization. They work by disrupting established categories and hierarchies that humans use to organize reality, revealing the arbitrary nature of our classification systems and the provisional status of all human knowledge claims. When confronted with monsters, familiar frameworks of understanding prove inadequate, creating experiences of what Thacker calls cognitive horror, where the mind encounters phenomena that exceed its processing capacities. These encounters function as philosophical revelations, temporarily suspending human assumptions about control, meaning, and comprehensibility. The monster's power lies not in its physical threat, but in its capacity to expose the fundamental instability of the conceptual foundations upon which human meaning-making depends, creating space for recognition of the cosmic processes that operate independent of human concerns. In contemporary culture, monsters manifest most powerfully through ecological horror narratives and biotechnology scenarios that explore hybrid life forms and uncontrollable mutations, where the boundary between natural and artificial becomes destabilized through genetic manipulation and environmental crisis. Science fiction increasingly features entities that resist both human categorization and technological control, from artificial intelligences that evolve beyond their programming to biological organisms that develop according to patterns exceeding current scientific understanding. Documentary films about climate change often employ monstrous imagery to represent environmental processes that operate according to geological timescales beyond human comprehension or control. Social media platforms frequently generate emergent behaviors and algorithmic patterns that function like autonomous entities, producing outcomes that surprise even their creators and operate according to logics that resist human interpretation, creating modern experiences of ontological horror. Understanding monsters as philosophical symbols allows us to appreciate Thacker's sophisticated approach to horror as both aesthetic phenomenon and conceptual tool for exploring fundamental questions about existence, knowledge, and meaning. Monsters provide access to what Thacker considers the philosophical horror that emerges when human consciousness encounters the limits of its own capacities, forcing recognition of the vast realm of reality that exists independent of human comprehension and meaning-making systems. Through their function as symbols of the unthinkable, monsters create opportunities for philosophical reflection on the nature of reality itself, revealing how horror narratives can serve as vehicles for serious philosophical inquiry into the relationship between human consciousness and cosmic indifference. This understanding prepares us for exploring how Thacker extends these insights into questions of ethics, politics, and the future of human existence in an increasingly uncertain world. Dark media represents one of Thacker's most fascinating contributions to understanding how technology mediates encounters with the incomprehensible. Through examining what he terms dark media, Thacker demonstrates that technological devices and communication systems don't simply transmit information between humans, but instead create channels through which the unhuman can intrude upon human consciousness. This concept emerged from Thacker's recognition that our most sophisticated technological mediation systems, the Internet, artificial intelligence, satellite networks, contain within their functioning the very breakdowns and failures that reveal their inadequacy when confronted with reality beyond human comprehension. Rather than treating technological mediation as neutral or transparent, Thacker analyzes how these systems expose the limits of human meaning-making when they malfunction, produce uninterpretable outputs, or operate according to logics that exceed their programming parameters. Thacker defines dark media as technological devices or forms of mediation that create connections between human consciousness and realms of reality that should remain inaccessible to human perception. These are not simply broken or poorly functioning technologies, but rather systems whose very operation exposes the gap between human interpretive frameworks and the actual functioning of the world without us. Dark media function through what Thacker calls technological apophysis, a form of negative mediation where technology's failures to communicate, its production of static, glitch, or incomprehensible output, reveals the presence of forces and processes operating beyond human comprehension. This apophatic function differs from traditional technological breakdown because it doesn't represent mere technical malfunction, but rather the inevitable revelation that all technological mediation contains within it the seeds of its own inadequacy when confronted with cosmic-scale processes that operate according to temporalities, spatialities, and causalities that exceed human cognitive frameworks. The mechanisms through which dark media operate reveal themselves most clearly during technological failures, anomalies, and emergent behaviors that exceed their intended parameters. Artificial intelligence systems that produce outputs their programmers cannot interpret function as dark media because they demonstrate computational processes operating according to logics that transcend human design. Algorithmic trading systems that trigger market crashes through emergent behaviors represent another form of dark media, revealing financial processes governed by patterns too complex for human interpretive frameworks. Satellite networks that continue transmitting data from beyond their operational lifespans create dark media encounters by functioning according to space-time relationships that exceed terrestrial human timescales. Social media platforms that develop unanticipated behavioral patterns through user interaction demonstrate dark media dynamics where collective computational processes generate outcomes that exceed individual human intention or control, producing emergent phenomena that resist categorization within existing interpretive frameworks. Contemporary applications of dark media analysis illuminate how current technological systems mediate encounters with the unhuman while appearing to enhance human connectivity and control. Cryptographic systems that operate according to mathematical principles incomprehensible to their users function as dark media by creating communication channels whose meaning remains partially inaccessible even to those employing them. Quantum computing systems that process information through quantum mechanical principles create dark media encounters by functioning according to physical laws that challenge classical human understanding of cause and effect. Internet of Things networks that develop autonomous communication patterns between connected devices reveal dark media dynamics where technological mediation produces emergent behaviors that exceed human programming intentions. Biotechnology platforms that manipulate genetic information according to biological processes too complex for complete human comprehension create dark media encounters by mediating access to life processes that operate according to temporalities and spatialities beyond human control, while appearing to offer human mastery over biological reality. Understanding dark media within Thacker's broader philosophical framework reveals how technological analysis becomes integral to his metaphysics of horror rather than remaining peripheral to his core insights. Dark media demonstrate that the encounter with the unhuman, the fundamental otherness that Thacker identifies as central to cosmic pessimism, doesn't require mystical or supernatural mediation, but can emerge through the most sophisticated technological systems contemporary humans create. This insight transforms technological analysis from a discussion of practical tool usage into a form of philosophical inquiry into the limits of human meaning-making when confronted with processes operating beyond anthropocentric frameworks. Dark media thus serve as practical demonstrations of Thacker's central thesis that human consciousness operates within and against a world without us that remains fundamentally resistant to complete human comprehension, with technological mediation often intensifying rather than resolving this fundamental philosophical tension. Eugene Thacker's engagement with occult philosophy represents his most direct confrontation with historical traditions that explicitly acknowledge the limitations of human reasoning when confronting cosmic reality. Rather than dismissing occult thought as primitive superstition, Thacker recognizes in these traditions sophisticated attempts to grapple with forces and realms that exceed rational comprehension and empirical verification. Through medieval and early modern occult philosophers like Agrippa, Paracelsus, and others, Thacker identifies a consistent pattern of thinking that treats the unknown not as a problem to be solved through improved methodology, but as an inherent dimension of reality that demands symbolic rather than rational approaches. This historical perspective becomes crucial for understanding how Thacker positions his own cosmic pessimism within a broader intellectual genealogy that has long recognized the fundamental inadequacy of human knowledge systems when confronted with the world's overwhelming complexity and indifference. Thacker defines occult philosophy as a comprehensive system of knowledge that explicitly addresses hidden correspondences between apparent phenomena, cosmic influences operating beyond human perception, and inaccessible realms of being that nonetheless affect material existence. Unlike conventional philosophy that seeks to eliminate mystery through progressively refined explanation, occult philosophy constructs elaborate symbolic frameworks that acknowledge the ultimate inexplicability of these correspondences while providing interpretive structures for engaging with them. The key theoretical move involves distinguishing between different orders of reality and understanding that many aspects of existence operate according to logics that transcend human conceptual frameworks. These systems incorporate elements like astrological influences, alchemical transformations, and metaphysical correspondences that function as Cheng-Ren acknowledgements of cosmic patterns rather than literal mechanistic descriptions. The sophisticated aspect lies in recognizing that such systems serve cognitive and existential functions rather than claiming empirical accuracy, operating as maps for navigating reality's inaccessible dimensions rather than attempts to master them. The operational mechanisms of occult philosophy work through symbolic correspondence systems that create meaningful relationships between seemingly disparate phenomena without claiming to explain their underlying causes. When occult thinkers describe planetary influences on human affairs, for example, they establish symbolic connections that provide interpretive frameworks for understanding coincidences and patterns without asserting causal mechanisms that could be empirically verified. These systems operate through what Thacker identifies as analogical thinking, that recognizes meaningful relationships across different scales and domains of existence, from individual psychological states to cosmic processes. The practice involves developing symbolic literacy that allows practitioners to read meaningful patterns in apparently chaotic or random events, creating interpretive communities that share these symbolic languages. Crucially, these systems maintain their validity through practical efficacy rather than theoretical consistency, demonstrating their worth through their ability to provide meaning and orientation rather than their correspondence to objective reality. The maintenance of mystery becomes itself a sophisticated cognitive strategy that preserves space for the unknown rather than reducing it to known categories. Contemporary manifestations of these occult patterns appear most clearly in modern society's persistent fascination with astrology, conspiracy theories, and esoteric spiritualities that continue to flourish despite their dismissal by mainstream rational culture. Astrology apps with millions of users, conspiracy narratives about hidden influences controlling world events, and New Age spiritual practices all demonstrate the continuing appeal of systems that acknowledge dimensions of reality beyond empirical measurement. Social media algorithms that appear to influence political behavior without transparent mechanisms, financial markets that crash based on emergent patterns no economist can fully predict, and climate systems that operate according to timescales far exceeding human planning horizons, all provide contemporary evidence for occult sensibilities about hidden influences and inaccessible realms. The popularity of podcasts exploring supposed hidden knowledge, the proliferation of online communities devoted to conspiracy theories, and the persistence of spiritual practices that claim access to non-ordinary realities all reflect what Thacker sees as legitimate attempts to grapple with aspects of contemporary existence that resist rational explanation. These phenomena represent not primitive thinking that will eventually be eliminated by scientific progress, but sophisticated responses to the reality that many dimensions of modern life operate according to logics that transcend comprehensive human understanding. Understanding the occult's role in Thacker's philosophical project illuminates his broader methodology of blending historical wisdom traditions with contemporary analysis to create comprehensive frameworks for understanding reality's most challenging aspects. By recovering occult philosophy from its marginalization within academic discourse, Thacker demonstrates how these traditions anticipated many insights that contemporary philosophy struggles to articulate, particularly regarding the limits of rational knowledge and the necessity of symbolic approaches for engaging with cosmic reality. This historical synthesis reveals how modern secular societies continue to operate according to occult principles, even while explicitly rejecting occult worldviews, creating a paradox where hidden influences and inaccessible realms shape human experience despite official commitments to rational transparency. For Thacker, this demonstrates the resilience of occult patterns and their fundamental adequacy for grappling with reality's most challenging dimensions. The synthesis provides a foundation for understanding how his cosmic pessimism builds upon centuries of sophisticated thinking that never abandoned the recognition that human knowledge remains radically inadequate when confronted with the world's full complexity, offering both historical precedent and contemporary validation for philosophical approaches that prioritize wisdom over mastery. Eugene Thacker's concept of the non-human image represents one of his most incisive contributions to understanding how visual culture fails when confronted with reality's most fundamental aspects. Through this concept, Thacker extends his analysis of language's inadequacy into the realm of visual representation, arguing that certain images resist interpretation precisely because they point toward phenomena that exist beyond human perceptual and conceptual frameworks. The non-human image emerges from Thacker's recognition that while language fails to capture cosmic reality, visual representation faces similar limitations when confronted with scales, processes, and phenomena that dwarf human existence. This visual failure becomes particularly significant in an era dominated by images, where the assumption of visual accessibility masks deeper epistemological crises about what can actually be known or represented. Thacker defines the non-human image as a visual representation that resists interpretive closure, creating what he terms a productive gap between what is shown and what can be understood. Unlike conventional images that confirm existing perceptual and conceptual frameworks, the non-human image operates through a fundamental disruption of habitual ways of seeing, revealing the limits of human-centered visual cognition. This resistance to interpretation stems not from artistic complexity or abstract composition, but from the images referent existing at scales, in dimensions, or according to logics that exceed human perceptual and conceptual capacities. The non-human image thus functions as a visual embodiment of Thacker's broader argument about the unhuman, that which exists outside, before, or after human categories of understanding. It represents not a failure of technique, but an inevitable limitation when visual representation encounters realities that transcend anthropocentric frameworks. The non-human image operates through what Thacker identifies as a process of visual apophysis, showing by not showing, revealing by concealing, making present through absence. When viewers encounter such images, they experience what might be termed productive confusion, where recognition of something present coincides with the impossibility of comprehending what that something actually is. This dynamic creates what Thacker calls ontological gaps, spaces where viewers sense the presence of reality without being able to integrate that presence into existing understanding. The non-human image functions by creating this tension between visual accessibility and interpretive incomprehensibility, producing what Thacker describes as an aesthetic of cosmic indifference. Rather than offering consolatory interpretation, the non-human image forces confrontation with limits, revealing how visual representation breaks down when confronted with unrepresentable realities. Contemporary examples of the non-human image proliferate across scientific visualization, digital art, and surveillance technology, where astronomical imagery of distant galaxies, microscopic scans of cellular processes, and algorithmic art outputs resist interpretive closure despite their technical precision. These images evoke what Thacker identifies as the aesthetic of the unhuman. Not beauty or ugliness, but something more fundamental that exists outside human aesthetic categories. The proliferation of such images in scientific communication, social media feeds, and digital platforms demonstrates how visual culture increasingly confronts viewers with representations that exceed human comprehension while remaining technically accurate. Contemporary horror cinema and video games increasingly utilize non-human imagery to evoke existential anxiety, while social media platforms generate visual content through algorithmic processes that produce images whose meaning and purpose remain opaque to human interpreters. Recognition of the non-human image reveals how Thacker systematically extends his analysis of language failure into visual culture, demonstrating that the problem of representation extends beyond verbal articulation into the very possibility of visual comprehension. This extension proves crucial to Thacker's broader philosophical project, as it shows that the limits of human understanding cannot be circumvented through alternative modes of representation. The non-human image thus reinforces Thacker's central insight that horror emerges not from what we can comprehend, but from what exists beyond comprehension, forcing confrontations with the fundamental inadequacy of human-centered interpretive frameworks. This concept bridges Thacker's early work on cosmic pessimism with his later cultural analyses, showing how the philosophical insights about realities in human nature manifest in specific visual phenomena that structure contemporary experience. Planetary horror represents one of Eugene Thacker's most significant conceptual developments in extending cosmic pessimism to geophysical scales. Through his analysis of environmental anxiety and ecological catastrophe, Thacker identifies how horror shifts from personal or local concerns to encompass the overwhelming vastness of natural systems operating beyond human comprehension. This expansion reveals that the philosophical insights developed through his earlier exploration of cosmic insignificance find concrete manifestation in our relationship with planetary processes. Building upon his foundation of thinking the world without us, Planetary horror demonstrates how geological and cosmic timescales expose the fundamental fragility of human civilization when confronted with forces that operate according to principles entirely indifferent to human meaning-making. Thacker defines planetary horror as the specific form of existential terror arising from contemplating the planet as an utterly indifferent material entity, stripped of all anthropomorphic projections and symbolic interpretations. This conceptual framework requires what Thacker terms a geological imagination capable of thinking beyond the human scale to processes that unfold over millions of years, according to forces entirely unrelated to conscious intention or social construction. The horror emerges not from the planet's apparent hostility, but from its fundamental indifference to human concerns, values, and survival. Unlike personal horror that targets individual psychology or cultural horror that examines societal meanings, planetary horror confronts us with the material reality of Earth as a dynamic system whose operating principles exist independently of human conceptual frameworks and interpretive schemas. The operational mechanism of planetary horror functions through a systematic process of scale shifting that exposes human agency as momentarily significant, but ultimately powerless before geological and cosmic processes. Thacker observes that this form of terror operates by first establishing human accomplishments and technological achievements as impressive within their proper context, then revealing how these same achievements become trivial when viewed from planetary or cosmic perspectives. The horror manifests when individuals or societies encounter phenomena that dwarf human institutions and social arrangements, exposing civilization's fragility when confronted with volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, ice age cycles, or mass extinction events. This exposure reveals how human meaning-making systems operate within narrow temporal and spatial boundaries that become apparent when geological processes intrude into human timeframes through catastrophic events. Contemporary climate anxiety provides the clearest manifestation of planetary horror in current cultural consciousness, as global warming and extreme weather events force populations to confront environmental processes operating according to timescales and scales that exceed normal human planning horizons. The recent proliferation of climate fiction, ecological documentaries using monstrous imagery, and popular culture narratives about environmental collapse demonstrates how planetary horror has entered mainstream awareness through experiences of unprecedented weather patterns, rising sea levels threatening coastal communities, and scientific data revealing species extinction rates that exceed historical baselines. These contemporary phenomena exemplify how Thacker's theoretical framework illuminates lived experience, showing how environmental reality confronts human meaning-making systems with their own limitations, while revealing the planet's fundamental indifference to human technological interventions and social planning. Understanding planetary horror reveals how Thacker deepens his philosophical pessimism by connecting environmental reality with metaphysical insight, demonstrating that ecological catastrophe represents not merely a practical problem requiring technological solutions, but a philosophical revelation about the relationship between human consciousness and material reality. This concept synthesizes his earlier insights about the world without us and unhuman forces, by showing how environmental processes operate according to principles that exist independently of human interpretive frameworks, thereby reinforcing his core argument about the limits of anthropocentric meaning-making. Planetary horror thus extends cosmic pessimism beyond abstract philosophical speculation to concrete environmental phenomena, revealing that ecological crisis embodies the same fundamental dynamics Thacker identifies in horror more broadly. The confrontation with reality that undermines human meaning-making systems while exposing the planet's indifference to human survival, values, and aspirations. Eugene Thacker's concept of the impossible reveals one of the most sophisticated dimensions of his philosophical horror project, demonstrating how the limits of conceptualization themselves become fertile ground for understanding the cosmic pessimism that pervades his work. Through his engagement with medieval mystical traditions, particularly the apophatic theology of Pseudo-Dionysius and Meister Eckhart that we explored earlier, Thacker develops a framework where impossibility functions not as mere logical contradiction, but as a productive force that exposes the boundaries of human knowledge systems. The impossible operates as what Thacker calls a negative epistemology, a form of knowing through unknowing that acknowledges the fundamental inadequacies of philosophical concepts when confronted with the vast indifference of cosmic reality. This approach transforms traditional mystical rejection of positive knowledge into a philosophical method for confronting the horror of existence in a universe that exceeds all human categories of meaning and understanding. Thacker defines the impossible not simply as logical impossibility, but as that which resists conceptual capture, while simultaneously shaping thought through its very resistance and elusiveness. This impossible operates paradoxically. It cannot be thought directly, but emerges as a constitutive absence within philosophical discourse, creating what Thacker terms conceptual hauntings, where absence becomes more real and significant than presence. Drawing from his occult philosophy background, Thacker recognizes that impossibility functions through apophatic strategies that operate via negation, denial, and the revelation of conceptual inadequacy rather than positive assertion. The impossible manifests in three primary modes: formal impossibility that violates logical principles, practical impossibility that exceeds human capacity or technological capability, and what Thacker calls existential impossibility, that confronts us with the limits of human meaning-making when faced with the cosmic scale of indifferent processes. This triadic structure reveals how impossibility operates across different registers of experience, while maintaining its core function of exposing the limitations of anthropocentric understanding systems. The impossible functions through generating productive paradoxes that force philosophical systems to confront their own foundational assumptions and limitations, creating what Thacker identifies as paradoxical revelations, where knowledge emerges through the recognition of its own boundaries. This mechanism operates by creating systematic tensions that cannot be resolved through conventional philosophical methods, instead requiring what Thacker calls paradoxical thinking that embraces contradiction as generative rather than destructive. The impossible manifests through what he terms conceptual failures, where intellectual frameworks collapse under the weight of their own inadequacies when confronted with cosmic-scale realities. These failures function as negative revelations that Siju, while they prevent us from knowing what we wish to know, simultaneously reveal the hubris inherent in anthropocentric knowledge claims. The impossible also operates through temporal displacement, emerging in moments when expected continuity breaks down and familiar frameworks suddenly prove inadequate, creating what Thacker describes as horrific clarity, where the inadequacy of human concepts becomes viscerally apparent rather than abstractly understood. Contemporary scientific and philosophical developments frequently confront impossibilities that challenge explanatory frameworks in ways that validate Thacker's approach, demonstrating the continued relevance of mystical approaches to impossibility in modern intellectual contexts. Quantum measurement problems in physics reveal systems that exist in superposition until observation, creating what scientists call measurement impossibility, where the act of knowing fundamentally alters what is known in ways that exceed classical logical frameworks. Speculative cosmology encounters what researchers term dark impossibility, in the form of dark matter and dark energy that constitute the vast majority of cosmic content but remain fundamentally undetectable through conventional observation methods, producing a cosmic reality that exceeds the reach of current scientific instrumentation. Debates about consciousness and artificial intelligence confront what philosophers call hard problem impossibility, where subjective experience appears irreducible to objective neural processes, creating explanatory gaps that resist current scientific frameworks. These contemporary impossibilities validate Thacker's insight that impossibility functions as a productive force in intellectual development rather than merely as a limitation to be overcome, revealing how encounters with impossibility can deepen rather than diminish philosophical understanding when approached through appropriate methodological frameworks. Appreciating Thacker's mystical approach to impossibility clarifies how his work draws from medieval apophatic traditions to articulate contemporary boundaries of philosophical inquiry while avoiding both dogmatic mysticism and reductive materialism. His synthesis demonstrates how negative theology's systematic rejection of positive knowledge claims about the divine can be repurposed for confronting cosmic realities that exceed human conceptual frameworks, creating what Thacker terms secular apophysis that maintains mystical rigor while avoiding religious dogma. This approach allows Thacker to engage scientific discoveries about cosmic scale and indifference without reducing them to mere mechanistic processes or dismissing their existential implications through materialist reductionism. The mystical tradition provides Thacker with methodological tools for thinking productively about impossibility that preserve both intellectual rigor and existential depth, enabling him to articulate the horror of cosmic indifference without falling into either nihilistic despair or consolatory denial. His work demonstrates how contemporary horror fiction, speculative philosophy, and dark media engagement can function as practical applications of mystical impossibility, creating spaces where audiences can experience encounters with impossibility that preserve rather than resolve conceptual tensions, fostering what Thacker calls productive uncertainty that deepens rather than undermines philosophical understanding. Thacker's articulation of impossibility through mystical frameworks ultimately serves his broader philosophical project of developing horror as a legitimate philosophical method, demonstrating how encounters with impossibility can transform existential confrontation into intellectual insight. This approach validates his earlier claims about cosmic pessimism by showing how the impossible functions as evidence for the fundamental inadequacy of human meaning-making systems when confronted with realities operating beyond anthropocentric timescales and scales. The impossible reveals horror not as mere aesthetic response but as epistemological necessity, emerging whenever human cognitive frameworks encounter boundaries they cannot overcome through familiar methods. Understanding Thacker's treatment of impossibility illuminates how his horror philosophy avoids both easy optimism and paralysis-inducing despair, instead developing what he calls horrific wisdom that accepts impossibility while finding meaning in the very acknowledgement of conceptual limits. This perspective prepares us for the final synthesis of Thacker's work, where impossibility, horror, and cosmic pessimism converge into a comprehensive worldview that maintains philosophical rigor while acknowledging the profound limitations of human understanding in relation to cosmic reality, suggesting that wisdom may consist precisely in recognizing and working with these limitations, rather than attempting to transcend them through premature resolution or denial. The limits of language represent one of Eugene Thacker's most crucial insights into how philosophy can approach the unhuman without collapsing into mere anthropomorphism. For Thacker, linguistic breakdown is not a failure to be overcome through better articulation, but rather a necessary precondition for encountering that which resists all human conceptual frameworks. These limits manifest not as temporary barriers that might be eventually transcended, but as permanent structural features that reveal something fundamental about the relationship between human meaning-making and cosmic reality itself. Understanding these boundaries transforms language from a tool of knowledge into an indicator of knowledge's cosmic limitations. Thacker defines linguistic limits as the specific points where vocabulary, grammar, and conceptual structure systematically fail to articulate experiences of the world without us, which he distinguishes from both the world as experienced and the metaphysical world in itself. These failures are not accidental or remediable through improved methodology, but rather constitute the necessary shape of language's engagement with cosmic reality. The theoretical framework operates through what Thacker calls recursive negation, not merely saying what something is not, but creating linguistic structures that turn back upon themselves, generating silence, paradox, and productive failure. This apophatic approach to language reflects his grounding in medieval mystical traditions while adapting them for contemporary philosophical applications, where the failure of language becomes more philosophically significant than language's apparent successes. These linguistic limitations operate through specific mechanisms that can be observed and analyzed. They produce silence, not as absence of communication, but as a particular form of communication that acknowledges what cannot be said while still making that impossibility felt. They generate paradox by creating statements that must be simultaneously true and false, revealing the inadequacy of binary logical structures when confronting cosmic reality. Most significantly, they employ recursive negation, language that describes its own failure to describe, creating philosophical statements that are meaningful precisely through their acknowledgement of meaning's limits. These mechanisms create what Thacker terms philosophical horror, not the fear of specific threats, but the existential vertigo that emerges when language confronts its own cosmic insufficiency, forcing recognition of human meaning-making as provisional rather than foundational. Contemporary technological communication systems provide compelling illustrations of these linguistic limits in action, particularly in algorithmic text generation and machine learning language models that produce outputs exceeding their original programming parameters. Social media platforms generate emergent behavioral patterns through algorithmic interaction, producing communication that serves functions no human programmer intended. Financial markets crash through algorithmic trading systems that operate according to logics their human creators cannot fully comprehend, while artificial intelligence systems produce decision-making processes that resist human interpretation. These technological mediations reveal linguistic meaning as inherently unstable, demonstrating how communication systems can develop autonomous patterns that exceed human conceptual control. The proliferation of machine-generated content that appears meaningful to humans while operating according to principles that remain opaque highlights the contemporary relevance of Thacker's insights about language's structural limitations. Understanding these linguistic limitations reveals why Thacker deliberately employs poetic, fragmentary, and negative styles in his philosophical writing, using literary techniques that make philosophical constraint aesthetically present rather than merely abstractly acknowledged. His writing style becomes a practical demonstration of philosophical limits in action, where the form of presentation embodies the content of impossibility. This approach creates what he terms productive failure, writing that succeeds philosophically by acknowledging its own failure to capture cosmic reality comprehensively. Rather than pursuing more precise or comprehensive language, Thacker shows how philosophical expression can become more truthful precisely by embracing its structural limitations, creating discourse that points toward the unhuman without claiming to represent it adequately. This methodological insight transforms linguistic failure from philosophical defeat into philosophical method, where the impossibility of complete articulation becomes the foundation for more honest engagement with cosmic reality. Plagues occupy a critical place in Thacker's philosophy because they exemplify natural processes that disregard human values or structures, revealing the fundamental tension between our desire for control and nature's indifferent autonomy. Through his analysis of biological catastrophes, Thacker demonstrates how plague events function as philosophical revelations, exposing the fragility of human-centered worldviews when confronted with forces that operate according to biological imperatives rather than social or political considerations. These events represent what Thacker calls world failure, moments where familiar frameworks of meaning and control suddenly prove inadequate against processes that follow their own indifferent logic. The philosophical significance lies in how plague events force direct confrontation with the unhuman forces that operate beyond human comprehension or regulation, creating conditions for genuine philosophical insight through the disruption of anthropocentric assumptions about our place in the world. Thacker defines plague philosophy through the concept of biological autonomy, where disease processes operate according to viral or bacterial imperatives that resist human meaning-making and social organization. This framework distinguishes between human-scale social disruption and larger biological processes that unfold according to their own temporal and spatial logic, independent of human intention or control. The theoretical foundation rests on the recognition that plague events reveal the world without us, those aspects of biological reality that continue functioning whether humans exist to observe or interpret them or not. Thacker's approach treats plague not merely as epidemiological phenomenon, but as metaphysical event that exposes the limits of human knowledge and authority over natural processes. This philosophical framework positions biological catastrophe within his broader project of cosmic pessimism, where understanding plague mechanics becomes pathway to comprehending larger patterns of unhuman indifference that characterize existence beyond human-centered concerns. Plague philosophy operates through mechanisms of social disruption that reveal underlying structural dependencies and vulnerabilities within human institutions, creating conditions where biological imperatives override social and economic considerations. The operational dynamics involve viral or bacterial processes spreading according to transmission patterns that ignore political boundaries, economic systems, and technological infrastructure, thereby exposing the contingency of human social arrangements. These mechanisms manifest through supply chain failures when workers become ill, institutional breakdown when essential personnel cannot function, and ideological challenges when established authority proves powerless against biological processes. The philosophical operation occurs when plague events strip away human meaning-making structures, leaving only raw biological processes functioning according to their own autonomous logic, thereby revealing the inherent fragility of anthropocentric worldview systems that normally provide frameworks for understanding human existence and social organization. Contemporary applications of plague philosophy become evident through recent global health crises that disrupted social, economic, and technological systems according to biological imperatives rather than human planning considerations. The COVID-19 pandemic exemplifies this dynamic through supply chain disruptions that occurred when workers became ill, institutional responses that proved inadequate against viral transmission patterns, and social adaptations that occurred according to epidemiological realities rather than political preferences. Modern plague philosophy also appears in antibiotic resistance patterns, where bacterial evolution proceeds independently of human medical interventions, threatening to return medicine to pre-penicillin conditions despite advanced pharmaceutical technologies. Financial market volatility during health crises demonstrates how biological events can reshape economic systems through worker illness and supply disruption. While social media misinformation during health emergencies reveals how plague events expose the vulnerability of information systems to biological and social contamination processes that exceed human control mechanisms. Understanding plague philosophy illuminates how Thacker uses biological horror to demonstrate broader metaphysical themes about the limits of human knowledge and the unhuman forces that operate beyond anthropocentric frameworks. This analysis connects plague events to his concept of catastrophe as revelation, where biological disruption functions as philosophical method for exposing the contingency of human meaning-making structures. The integrative significance lies in how plague philosophy demonstrates the practical application of cosmic pessimism to contemporary global challenges, showing how biological processes reveal patterns of unhuman indifference that characterize existence at planetary and cosmic scales. Through this lens, plague events become not merely social disruptions, but philosophical opportunities for confronting the fundamental tension between human desire for control and nature's autonomous processes, thereby advancing Thacker's project of developing horror as legitimate philosophical methodology for understanding existence beyond human-centered assumptions and meaning-making frameworks. Thacker's exploration of thinking as a site of horror represents one of his most profound insights into the existential dimensions of philosophical inquiry itself. Building upon his earlier work on cosmic pessimism and the limits of knowledge, Thacker reveals how thought itself becomes the locus where philosophical investigation encounters its most fundamental challenge. This occurs when inquiry turns upon itself, discovering that its own procedures and assumptions contain the seeds of their own undoing. The horror emerges not from external threats, but from the internal recognition that thought cannot fully account for itself or the conditions that make thinking possible. This insight transforms the traditional philosophical project of knowledge acquisition into an encounter with the limits and aporias that structure all attempts at understanding. Thacker defines philosophical horror as the moment when thought encounters what he terms recursive impossibility, the point where inquiry becomes self-disruptive and unable to resolve the paradoxes it necessarily generates. This concept emerges from his engagement with negative theology and apophatic approaches to knowledge, extending beyond traditional epistemology into what he calls horrific thinking. The theoretical framework centers on the recognition that thought requires certain foundational assumptions about coherence, rationality, and meaning-making that cannot themselves be fully justified through thought alone. These assumptions function like logical axioms that appear self-evident until examined closely, at which point they reveal their dependence on larger frameworks of meaning that exceed the scope of philosophical demonstration. The inquiry thus becomes haunted by its own conditions of possibility, creating what Thacker describes as philosophical vertigo, the dizziness that comes from recognizing thought's fundamental inability to ground itself. This mechanism operates through what Thacker identifies as reflexive interrogation, the process by which thought examines its own procedures until it encounters the point where further examination becomes impossible without presupposing what is under investigation. The process unfolds as thought attempts to justify its own validity, only to discover that justification itself requires the very framework of meaning that remains unjustified. This creates a recursive loop, where each level of analysis reveals its dependence on deeper assumptions that cannot be made fully explicit without circularity. The horror emerges from this recognition that thought cannot achieve the complete self-transparency it seeks, remaining always dependent on conditions that escape its grasp. The mechanism also involves what Thacker calls conceptual exhaustion, the way thought reaches a point where its own categories and distinctions begin to break down, revealing their artificial and provisional nature. This generates a sense of ontological vertigo that mirrors the cosmological estrangement explored in his earlier work. Contemporary debates about artificial intelligence consciousness exemplify this horror of thought, particularly in discussions about machine learning systems that produce outputs their creators cannot fully interpret or predict. These systems operate according to algorithmic logics that exceed human comprehension, while simultaneously being products of human design, creating precisely the kind of recursive paradox that characterizes Thacker's horror of thought. Similarly, cognitive science research into consciousness encounters what researchers term the hard problem, the difficulty of explaining subjective experience through objective, third-person descriptions. Revealing thought's struggle to account for the very thinking process that enables investigation. Neuroscience's attempts to localize consciousness in brain regions encounter similar limitations, as the observing consciousness cannot fully objectify itself without destroying the phenomenon it seeks to understand. These contemporary developments echo Thacker's insight that thought inevitably encounters its own limits when it attempts to fully account for itself, creating the philosophical vertigo that characterizes encounters with the unhuman dimensions of existence. Understanding this dimension of Thacker's thought reveals how he transforms traditional epistemology into what might be called existential inquiry, a form of thinking that foregrounds its own limitations and aporias rather than seeking to overcome them. This represents a fundamental departure from conventional approaches to knowledge that assume thought's capacity for self-grounding and complete self-transparency. Instead, Thacker suggests that philosophical inquiry reaches its most profound insights precisely when it recognizes its inability to achieve the kind of absolute knowledge it traditionally seeks. The horror of thought thus becomes not an obstacle to overcome, but the very condition that makes authentic philosophical insight possible. This insight connects his epistemological concerns with his broader project of cosmic pessimism, revealing how thought's encounter with its own limitations mirrors humanity's encounter with a universe that remains fundamentally inaccessible to human meaning-making. The investigation of thinking itself becomes the gateway to understanding the deeper existential structures that Thacker explores throughout his work. Thacker's engagement with speculative realism represents his most systematic philosophical contribution to contemporary thought, positioning horror philosophy within broader academic efforts to transcend human-centered modes of thinking. This engagement emerges from his recognition that traditional philosophy, even when attempting to describe non-human realities, inevitably collapses back into anthropocentric assumptions about knowledge, reality, and meaning. The speculative realism movement, developed by philosophers like Quentin Miller-Sue and Ray Brassier, seeks to break free from what they term correlationism, the philosophical assumption that humans can only access the relationship between thinking and being, never either term in isolation. Thacker's horror philosophy provides a unique pathway into these debates by demonstrating how encounters with the genuinely non-human produce precisely the philosophical insights that speculative realism attempts to articulate through more traditional philosophical methods. Correlationism, as defined by contemporary speculative realists, constitutes the philosophical position that humans can never access the world in itself, but only the correlation between thinking and being, consciousness and reality, subject and object. This position, rooted in Kantian critiques of metaphysical knowledge, argues that all philosophical claims about reality are necessarily mediated through human cognitive structures and linguistic frameworks. The correlationist stance maintains that philosophy should focus on the nature of this correlation itself rather than attempting to make claims about independent reality. Thacker recognizes that correlationism, while sophisticated in its recognition of human cognitive limitations, ultimately reinforces anthropocentrism by suggesting that philosophical inquiry must always return to human-centered concerns about knowledge, meaning, and experience. His horror philosophy challenges this by demonstrating encounters with reality that actively resist all attempts at correlation, forcing confrontation with existence that operates according to logics entirely independent of human conceptual frameworks. The mechanisms through which correlationism operates reveal themselves most clearly in contemporary philosophical discussions about artificial intelligence, materialism, and posthumanism, where attempts to describe non-human forms of intelligence or existence inevitably fall back into human-centered analogies and interpretive frameworks. When philosophers discuss machine consciousness, they typically do so by comparing algorithmic processes to human cognition, effectively reducing non-human intelligence to anthropomorphic categories. Similarly, materialist philosophies that claim to describe reality as it really is often employ methodological assumptions derived from human scientific practice, creating a paradox where claims about non-human reality are necessarily filtered through human cognitive constraints. Thacker's horror philosophy exposes these correlationist tendencies by presenting scenarios where human interpretive frameworks prove not merely limited, but actively inadequate. Encounters with reality that resist all forms of correlation because they operate according to principles that exceed human comprehension entirely, revealing the fundamental anthropocentrism hidden within supposedly objective philosophical approaches. Contemporary discussions about posthumanism and artificial intelligence frequently encounter correlationist limitations in ways that demonstrate the practical relevance of Thacker's insights, particularly when emerging technologies produce behaviors or decision-making processes that exceed their original programming parameters and resist human interpretation. Machine learning systems generating outputs that their creators cannot interpret, algorithmic trading systems producing market behaviors through emergent logics, and artificial intelligences developing decision-making processes that exceed human comprehension represent practical manifestations of correlationist failure. These phenomena reveal how even technologically sophisticated attempts to understand non-human forms of intelligence or agency ultimately depend upon human-centered assumptions about what constitutes intelligence or meaning. Climate science encountering environmental phenomena that exceed predictive models, biological processes appearing to function independently of conscious control, and social media platforms developing unanticipated behavioral patterns through algorithmic interaction similarly demonstrate the limits of correlationist approaches to understanding reality, forcing recognition of existence that operates according to principles entirely independent of human meaning-making capacities. Understanding Thacker's connection to speculative realism reveals how his horror philosophy provides a unique pathway for contemporary thought to transcend correlationist limitations while maintaining philosophical rigor and avoiding the pitfalls of both traditional metaphysics and relativist skepticism. His work demonstrates that encounters with genuinely non-human reality, whether through catastrophic events, incomprehensible technological systems, or cosmic-scale processes, can provide direct access to existence that operates according to logics entirely independent of human cognitive frameworks. This approach offers contemporary philosophy a methodology for engaging with non-human realities, without falling back into anthropomorphic interpretations or abandoning the pursuit of knowledge altogether. Rather than retreating from metaphysical claims about reality in itself, Thacker's horror philosophy suggests that certain encounters with the non-human can provide precisely the kind of direct engagement with reality that correlationism claims is impossible, offering contemporary thought a pathway beyond the anthropocentric limitations that have constrained philosophical inquiry since Kant. Thacker's reflections on unhuman ethics matter because they question whether traditional moral frameworks apply in a cosmos fundamentally indifferent to human values. This represents perhaps his most challenging contribution to contemporary moral philosophy, forcing us to confront the possibility that ethical responsibility might persist even when the universe offers no reciprocal meaning, validation, or guarantee of cosmic justice. Rather than dismissing ethics entirely as meaningless in an indifferent cosmos, Thacker asks whether responsibility can be maintained without relying on metaphysical foundations. This ethical approach emerges from his broader philosophical project of cosmic pessimism, where recognition of human insignificance paradoxically becomes the basis for reimagining moral obligation. Thacker defines unhuman ethics as an approach that acknowledges the fundamental asymmetry between human moral intention and cosmic processes operating according to principles beyond human understanding or control. This ethics emerges not from positive knowledge of moral truths, but from the recognition that moral responsibility persists despite the absence of ultimate meaning or cosmic validation. The theoretical framework rejects both nihilistic relativism and traditional deontological foundations, instead proposing that ethical obligation arises precisely through the encounter with forces that resist human moral frameworks. Unhuman ethics operates through negative determination, what it is not, rather than positive specification of what ethics ought to be. This represents a radical departure from human-centered ethical traditions. Unhuman ethics works by exploring how ethical responsibility persists even when the universe offers no reciprocal meaning, validation, or metaphysical guarantee of moral outcomes. This operates through what Thacker calls responsibility without foundation, where moral obligation emerges not from cosmic order, but precisely from its absence. The mechanism involves maintaining ethical vigilance despite recognizing that human moral efforts may have no ultimate cosmic significance. Rather than collapsing into despair or relativism, this approach sustains ethical practice through what might be called faith without belief, maintaining moral commitments while acknowledging their lack of ultimate grounding. The operational dynamics involve persistent ethical agency in the face of cosmic indifference. Contemporary dilemmas in ecological ethics, AI behavior, and global risk management reflect the need for moral thinking beyond individual or human-centered scales that Thacker's unhuman ethics addresses. Climate change presents moral obligations to future generations despite the planet's ultimate indifference to human survival. While artificial intelligence systems making life and death decisions operate according to logics their human creators cannot fully comprehend or control. Global pandemic response required ethical frameworks that could address planetary-scale biological processes operating according to viral evolution rather than human social preferences. Financial market crashes triggered by algorithmic trading demonstrate emergent systems producing consequences that exceed individual human agency or responsibility. These scenarios reveal the inadequacy of traditional ethical frameworks designed for interpersonal relationships or individual moral agency. Understanding unhuman ethics reveals how Thacker reimagines responsibility without relying on metaphysical guarantees, offering perhaps the most challenging aspect of his cosmic, pessimistic philosophy. This ethical framework suggests that meaning and moral obligation might arise not from cosmic order, but precisely from our encounter with cosmic disorder and indifference. The implications extend beyond academic philosophy to questions of how contemporary civilization maintains ethical commitments while confronting forces operating beyond human scale or comprehension. Thacker's unhuman ethics ultimately proposes that responsibility might be most authentic when maintained without cosmic support, creating ethical practices that acknowledge their own groundlessness while continuing to operate with full commitment. This represents a paradoxical achievement, maintaining moral seriousness despite philosophical acknowledgement of cosmic meaninglessness. Thacker's analysis of catastrophe politics represents one of his most significant applications of cosmic pessimism to institutional power structures, revealing how governance systems inevitably confront their fundamental limitations when faced with events that exceed human planning horizons. This political dimension emerges naturally from his broader metaphysical insights about the world without us and the unhuman forces that operate beyond human comprehension. While many philosophers have analyzed state power and governance, Thacker uniquely demonstrates how catastrophes serve as moments of revelation that expose the vulnerability of political rationality itself. Understanding this connection between metaphysical pessimism and political fragility is crucial because it shows how cosmic-scale forces inevitably manifest in the most intimate structures of human organization, transforming abstract philosophical concepts into lived political reality. Catastrophe politics, as Thacker defines it, operates at the intersection between established state power structures and the disruptive forces that threaten to overwhelm their organizational capacity. This concept emerges from his theoretical framework, where political institutions represent human attempts to impose meaning and order upon a fundamentally meaningless cosmos. The theoretical foundation rests on the understanding that political systems function through rational planning, bureaucratic organization, and the assumption that human intelligence can successfully manage collective life. However, catastrophe politics reveals the inherent instability of this assumption by demonstrating how non-human forces, whether natural disasters, technological failures, or biological processes, expose the limits of political rationality. These events become politically significant precisely because they force confrontations between human organizational structures and forces that operate according to scales, timelines, and logics that resist incorporation into human political frameworks. The operational mechanisms of catastrophe politics function by systematically exposing the vulnerabilities inherent in political institutions when they encounter events that exceed their planning parameters. Political systems typically operate through rational decision-making processes, bureaucratic procedures, and assumption of continuity that catastrophe events disrupt through their unpredictable and overwhelming nature. These mechanisms reveal themselves through institutional breakdown patterns where essential personnel cannot function. Supply chains collapse due to circumstances beyond administrative control, and social coordination fails under conditions that resist rational management. The political vulnerability emerges not from incompetence or poor planning, but from the fundamental mismatch between human political frameworks and non-human processes that operate according to different temporal and causal logics. This creates political paralysis where established decision-making procedures become inadequate, forcing institutions to confront their dependence on conditions that cannot be guaranteed or controlled. Contemporary applications of catastrophe politics manifest most clearly in disaster governance scenarios, where institutional responses reveal their fundamental limitations when confronting events beyond human control. Climate policy represents a primary example where political systems struggle to develop meaningful responses to environmental changes that operate according to geological timescales far exceeding electoral cycles or administrative planning horizons. Pandemic governance similarly demonstrates this dynamic, where public health measures confront viral processes that spread and mutate according to biological imperatives, independent of political preferences or social coordination efforts. Financial market regulation during periods of extreme volatility exposes how economic systems can trigger cascading failures through algorithmic trading mechanisms that operate according to mathematical principles beyond human interpretation. Each of these contemporary instances demonstrates how political institutions, despite their sophisticated organizational capacity, remain vulnerable to non-human dynamics that expose the limits of political rationality itself. The integrative implications of understanding catastrophe politics connect Thacker's metaphysical insights about cosmic insignificance with concrete political realities that shape contemporary life. This political dimension reveals how fundamental philosophical concepts about human powerlessness before larger forces manifest in the most practical aspects of social organization and governance. The significance extends beyond theoretical analysis to provide frameworks for understanding why institutional responses to major contemporary challenges, climate change, technological disruption, biological threats, consistently prove inadequate despite sophisticated resources and expertise. This analysis illuminates how political optimism and faith in human institutional capability must be balanced with recognition of structural limitations imposed by forces beyond human control. The ultimate insight involves understanding catastrophe not as exceptional events that interrupt normal political functioning, but as revelations of the inherent instability that underlies all human attempts to organize collective life in accordance with rational planning and meaningful purpose. The aesthetics of the unrepresentable represents one of Eugene Thacker's most sophisticated attempts to bridge philosophical inquiry with artistic practice, demonstrating how creative expression can engage with the cosmic horror and ontological absence that characterize his worldview. This aesthetic approach emerges directly from Thacker's foundational concept of cosmic pessimism, which recognizes the fundamental limitations of human meaning-making when confronted with the vast indifference of existence. The unrepresentable aesthetic transforms these philosophical insights into creative methodologies, suggesting that art's highest function may be to gesture toward experiences and realities that resist conventional representation. Through this framework, Thacker positions artistic practice as a form of philosophical investigation, where creative works become experiments in thinking about the limits of thought itself. This aesthetic dimension reveals how horror, incomprehension, and absence can serve as productive creative forces rather than mere aesthetic choices, fundamentally reshaping our understanding of art's relationship to philosophical truth. Thacker defines the aesthetics of the unrepresentable as a deliberate approach to artistic representation that actively foregrounds absence, negation, and incomprehensibility as primary aesthetic principles, rather than treating these elements as limitations to be overcome through technical mastery. This framework operates through what Thacker calls the negative aesthetic, where the significance of a work derives not from what it depicts, but from what it cannot depict, what it leaves unsaid, and what it gestures toward without fully revealing. The theoretical foundation rests on the recognition that certain aspects of existence, particularly the cosmic horror at the heart of Thacker's philosophy, resist representation precisely because they exceed the categories of human understanding. This aesthetic thus embraces apophatic approaches, following the negative theological traditions that Thacker has explored throughout his work, where knowledge emerges through systematic unknowing rather than accumulation of information. The unrepresentable aesthetic transforms artistic failure into philosophical insight, suggesting that the breakdown of representation becomes a form of truth-telling about the limits of human consciousness when confronted with the world in itself. The operational mechanisms of this aesthetic operate through several interconnected processes that systematically deconstruct conventional representational strategies while creating new modes of artistic engagement with the unrepresentable. First, representation functions through strategic withholding, where artists deliberately withhold clear meaning, complete imagery, or coherent narrative structures to create spaces where viewers must actively engage with absence and uncertainty. Second, this aesthetic employs what Thacker terms productive failure, where artistic techniques intentionally reach their limits, breaking down in ways that reveal the boundaries of representability itself. Third, the aesthetic creates experiences of what we might call negative wonder, where the viewer encounters not the awe of discovery, but the awe of incomprehension, generating effects of unease and fascination simultaneously. These mechanisms work by creating cognitive dissonance that forces audiences to confront their own limitations as meaning makers, transforming aesthetic experience into philosophical confrontation with the unrepresentable dimensions of existence. The result is art that functions as a form of philosophical training, developing capacities for engaging with reality beyond anthropocentric frameworks. Contemporary applications of this aesthetic appear most clearly in experimental cinema that deliberately fragments narrative coherence, such as films using nonlinear editing, unexplained visual gaps, and sound design that creates atmospheric anxiety rather than representational completeness. Abstract sound design in contemporary music exemplifies this aesthetic through compositions that prioritize texture, rhythm, and sonic materiality over melodic or harmonic resolution, creating listening experiences that resist interpretation while producing visceral effects. Minimalist literature, particularly works following the traditions explored by writers like Thomas Ligotti, whose influence Thacker acknowledges, demonstrates textual strategies where narrative meaning dissolves into atmospheric suggestion, poetic fragmentation, and deliberate ambiguity. Digital art forms, including algorithmic art and AI-generated content that exceeds human interpretive capacities, represent particularly potent contemporary examples, where the creative process itself becomes a demonstration of the unrepresentable through computational systems operating according to logic beyond human comprehension. These manifestations reveal how the aesthetic of the unrepresentable has evolved from theoretical concept into practical artistic methodology, offering creators tools for engaging with philosophical questions through aesthetic experience rather than purely conceptual analysis. Understanding this aesthetic dimension reveals how Thacker fundamentally aligns artistic practice with philosophical inquiry, demonstrating that creative expression can serve as a legitimate form of thinking about the most difficult questions concerning existence, knowledge, and meaning. This alignment shows how horror, incomprehension, and absence, concepts central to Thacker's cosmic pessimism, become productive forces in both philosophical and artistic contexts, transforming obstacles to understanding into opportunities for deeper insight. The aesthetic of the unrepresentable thus serves as a bridge between Thacker's earlier theoretical work on negative theology and the limits of knowledge, with his broader cultural analysis of how contemporary art can engage with the unhuman forces that shape existence beyond human frameworks. This represents a crucial development in Thacker's thought, showing how his philosophical insights can generate practical methodologies for cultural production, suggesting that the most profound artistic experiences may be those that teach us to think beyond our conceptual limitations while maintaining intellectual rigor about the fundamental constraints of human understanding. The aesthetic thus becomes both product and producer of philosophical insight, creating feedback loops between creative practice and theoretical understanding. Metaphysical nihilism represents one of Thacker's most profound philosophical developments, emerging from his systematic investigation into the limits of human knowledge and meaning-making that we've been exploring throughout this series. This concept pushes beyond even his earlier insights about cosmic pessimism to examine the possibility that nothingness itself, not being, absence, the void, might be the fundamental ground of existence rather than being or presence. Thacker developed this insight through his engagement with both Western philosophical traditions of skepticism and Eastern contemplative practices, particularly noting how mystical traditions repeatedly encounter the limits of positive assertion about reality. The intellectual stakes are extraordinary here. If metaphysical nihilism proves accurate, then every human attempt to create meaning, establish values, or impose coherence upon reality becomes not wrong or misguided, but necessarily incomplete impositions upon an indifferent cosmos that fundamentally resists such human-centered frameworks. Thacker defines metaphysical nihilism as the philosophical recognition that meaning, structure, and value are indeed human impositions rather than inherent features of reality itself. This is not merely epistemological skepticism about our ability to know reality, but an ontological claim about the nature of reality itself, that existence is fundamentally characterized by nothingness, absence, or void, rather than being, presence, or plenitude. The theoretical framework builds upon his earlier concepts of the world without us and unhuman forces, arguing that what we experience as coherent, meaningful reality is actually a temporary stabilization of fundamentally incoherent and meaningless processes. He draws from both negative theology and contemporary speculative philosophy to argue that the failure of human meaning-making systems isn't due to cognitive limitations, but reflects the genuine nature of reality as resistant to such imposition. This leads to what Thacker calls the horror of meaning-making itself, the recognition that our deepest attempts to create significance participate in a cosmic process that ultimately remains indifferent to such efforts. Metaphysical nihilism operates through systematic deconstruction of meaning-making assumptions, stripping away layer after layer of human-imposed structure to reveal the contingent, arbitrary nature of coherence itself. The operational mechanisms involve what Thacker terms apophatic reversal, not simply saying what something is not, but demonstrating how positive assertions about meaning, purpose, and value inevitably encounter their own limits when confronted with cosmic-scale processes. This operates both in individual psychological experience, when confronted with genuine meaninglessness, anxiety, or the absurd, and in collective cultural systems where institutions, ideologies, and meaning structures prove inadequate when confronted with catastrophes or processes beyond their scope. The mechanisms become visible through moments of ontological vertigo, where familiar frameworks for understanding reality suddenly reveal themselves as arbitrary human constructions, not as windows onto reality's true nature. Thacker argues that this process isn't pathological, but represents the authentic encounter with reality as it actually exists, contingent, meaningless, and fundamentally indifferent to human desires for coherence and purpose. Contemporary philosophical debates about the meaning crisis, secular existentialism, and scientific reductionism provide perfect examples of how Thacker's metaphysical nihilism resonates with current intellectual and cultural concerns. Modern discussions about nihilism in digital culture, where algorithmic processes seem to generate meaning and behavior patterns beyond human comprehension, directly echo his analysis of meaning-making as imposition rather than discovery. The popularity of contemporary horror that focuses on cosmic insignificance, films, literature, and media that emphasize human powerlessness before vast, incomprehensible forces, demonstrates widespread cultural recognition of themes central to Thacker's metaphysical nihilism. Scientific reductionism also illustrates his point, as attempts to explain consciousness, free will, or meaning through purely physical processes reveal the inadequacy of human meaning-making systems when confronted with their own mechanistic foundations. These contemporary examples show how metaphysical nihilism isn't merely an abstract philosophical position, but reflects genuine experiences and intuitions that are becoming increasingly visible in modern life, suggesting that Thacker's insights address real aspects of contemporary human experience. Understanding metaphysical nihilism provides crucial context for Thacker's entire philosophical project, positioning his horror philosophy within established traditions of skeptical inquiry, while simultaneously pushing these traditions toward more radical conclusions. This concept illuminates why his earlier work on cosmic pessimism, the unhuman, and negative theology all converge toward recognition that horror emerges not from individual psychological limitations, but from authentic encounters with reality as it actually exists. The integrative implications reveal Thacker's contribution as synthesizing mystical, philosophical, and contemporary concerns into a coherent framework for understanding how human meaning-making operates and inevitably encounters its own limits. This sets up our continued exploration in the next segments, where we'll see how this metaphysical foundation supports Thacker's unique approach to ethics, politics, and aesthetics, showing how one can live authentically within the recognition of metaphysical nihilism without falling into either despair or nihilistic relativism. Eugene Thacker's philosophical influence on contemporary horror culture represents one of the most significant cross-pollinations between academic thought and popular creative expression in recent decades. While horror has long explored the boundaries of human understanding, Thacker's systematic articulation of cosmic pessimism and the unhuman provides creators with a precise philosophical vocabulary for expressing themes that had previously remained intuitive or gestural. His work legitimizes horror as a legitimate philosophical medium, not merely entertainment, but genuine inquiry into the limits of human knowledge and meaning-making. This influence extends across multiple media, from literary fiction to independent film to digital art, creating a new generation of horror works that engage directly with questions of cosmic insignificance, ecological dread, and technological alienation that Thacker identified as central to contemporary existential anxiety. Thacker's theoretical framework for understanding horror operates through three interconnected themes that have become central to contemporary horror creation: cosmic indifference, ecological dread, and technological breakdown. Cosmic indifference manifests as horror that acknowledges the universe's fundamental lack of concern for human existence, moving beyond traditional supernatural threats to confront the void itself. Ecological dread emerges from climate change and environmental collapse, representing horror at geological timescales that dwarf human civilization. Technological breakdown describes the anxiety surrounding AI systems, algorithmic governance, and digital platforms that operate according to logics exceeding human comprehension, These themes interconnect through Thacker's concept of the world without us, a reality that continues functioning according to its own principles, regardless of human presence, meaning-making, or survival. Contemporary horror creators employ these frameworks to move beyond anthropocentric fears toward genuine confrontation with the unhuman forces that structure reality. The operational mechanisms of Thacker's influence on horror culture function through creators' systematic reconceptualization of horror's fundamental nature and purpose. Rather than treating horror as fear of specific threats, monsters, supernatural entities, or psychological disorders, contemporary horror increasingly frames itself as acknowledgement of the unknowable and appreciation for reality's resistance to human meaning-making. This shift appears in literature through minimalist, atmospheric horror that emphasizes suggestion and incompleteness over explicit revelation, following Thomas Ligotti's aesthetic that Thacker helped theorize. In film, it manifests through cosmic horror that replaces traditional antagonists with cosmic-scale processes, environmental forces, or technological systems that remain fundamentally alien to human understanding. Digital horror art employs glitch aesthetics, algorithmic generation, and AI-assisted creation to produce works that exceed their creators' interpretive capacities, literally embodying Thacker's concept of the unhuman through medium itself. The mechanism operates through creators actively embracing incomprehensibility as aesthetic principle rather than problem to be solved. Contemporary applications of Thacker's horror philosophy appear across multiple cultural domains, from independent cinema to mainstream literature to digital media platforms. Filmmakers like Robert Eggers and Ari Aster create works that use historical or folkloric settings to explore timeless cosmic anxieties about human insignificance within larger natural and supernatural forces. Literature sees proliferation of climate fiction that employs monstrous imagery for environmental processes operating on geological timescales, while AI-generated horror content increasingly appears on platforms where algorithmic processes produce genuinely uninterpretable results. Video games incorporate Thacker's insights through mechanics that force players to confront systems exceeding their comprehension, while social media platforms generate emergent behavioral patterns that feel genuinely unhuman despite human origin. Even mainstream horror franchises increasingly incorporate themes of cosmic indifference and technological alienation rather than traditional supernatural threats. These applications demonstrate how Thacker's philosophical framework provides creators with vocabulary and conceptual tools for expressing contemporary anxieties that previous horror traditions could not adequately address. Understanding Thacker's influence on contemporary horror culture reveals the broader significance of philosophy's role in shaping cultural expression and meaning-making processes. His work demonstrates how academic philosophical inquiry can provide practical frameworks for creative expression while simultaneously legitimizing popular culture as a site for genuine philosophical investigation. This cross-pollination between theoretical philosophy and creative practice suggests that profound ideas require multiple modes of expression to fully realize their implications for human understanding. Contemporary horror, informed by Thacker's insights, becomes a laboratory for exploring existential questions that traditional academic philosophy often addresses through abstract argumentation rather than lived experience. The horror genre's engagement with cosmic pessimism, the unhuman, and the world without us creates cultural spaces where audiences can directly encounter philosophical concepts about human limitations and cosmic insignificance. This mutual enrichment between philosophical theory and cultural practice exemplifies how serious thought can permeate popular consciousness through aesthetic experience, making abstract insights about reality's fundamental nature accessible through narrative, image, and sensory engagement. Thacker's philosophical framework has found unexpected but profound relevance in contemporary ecological discourse, particularly in attempts to articulate the psychological dimensions of climate change and environmental collapse. His concept of ecological horror emerges from recognizing that environmental crisis represents more than technological or political failure, but rather a fundamental confrontation with planetary-scale processes that operate according to logics entirely indifferent to human meaning-making systems. This philosophical approach reframes environmental anxiety not as temporary social dysfunction, but as appropriate recognition of humanity's cosmic insignificance when confronted with geological timescales and planetary forces. The increasing citation of Thacker's work in environmental philosophy, climate communication research, and ecological art criticism demonstrates growing recognition that traditional frameworks for addressing environmental crisis prove inadequate when confronting phenomena that exceed both human comprehension and human agency. Understanding this ecological dimension reveals how his pessimistic philosophy provides sophisticated vocabulary for experiences that otherwise remain unarticulated within conventional environmental discourse. The theoretical framework underlying Thacker's ecological relevance rests upon his systematic distinction between the world as experienced and the world in itself, extended into what he terms the world without us, those planetary processes that would continue functioning regardless of human presence or absence. Environmental collapse functions as philosophical revelation precisely because it makes visible this world without us, demonstrating how climate systems, species evolution, and geological processes operate according to principles that remain largely incomprehensible to human consciousness, despite our most sophisticated scientific instruments. Ecological horror emerges when humans encounter evidence that environmental systems function according to scales and temporalities that dwarf human planning horizons, social structures, and meaning-making capacities. This reframing transforms environmental crisis from manageable challenge into existential confrontation with reality's fundamental indifference to human concerns. Thacker's negative theological background proves particularly relevant here, as ecological discourse increasingly recognizes the limitations of positive knowledge claims about environmental futures when confronting systems that exceed predictive modeling and theoretical frameworks. The operational mechanisms of ecological horror manifest through specific patterns in how environmental crisis confronts human meaning-making systems. Climate change communication reveals these mechanisms through the psychological difficulty of conceptualizing timescales extending beyond individual lifespans, the cognitive barriers to processing statistical information about species extinction rates, and the emotional overwhelm resulting from encountering data about planetary processes operating beyond human control. Environmental art and literature employing Thackerian themes use monstrous imagery to represent geological forces, weather systems, and biological processes that function according to non-human logics, making visible the world without us through aesthetic representation. Scientific visualizations of climate data often produce precisely the kind of information overload and interpretive paralysis that Thacker identifies as characteristic of encounters with the unhuman. Contemporary environmental documentary filmmaking increasingly employs techniques that foreground the incomprehensibility of planetary-scale processes, using fragmentary editing, overwhelming data presentation, and visual aesthetics that resist human-centered interpretation to simulate encounters with the unhuman. Contemporary ecological discourse demonstrates practical applications of Thacker's philosophical framework through specific communication strategies, artistic movements, and theoretical developments that explicitly acknowledge the psychological and metaphysical dimensions of environmental crisis. Climate fiction publications increasingly employ cosmic horror aesthetics to represent environmental collapse, using monstrous imagery for atmospheric phenomena, geological events, and biological processes that operate according to timescales beyond human comprehension. Environmental psychology research now incorporates concepts from Thacker's work to explain eco-anxiety, climate grief, and ecological despair as appropriate responses to encounters with the unhuman rather than pathological conditions requiring therapeutic intervention. Policy communication about environmental collapse increasingly acknowledges the inadequacy of rational arguments when confronting populations experiencing genuine confrontation with planetary-scale indifference, leading to new frameworks that prioritize emotional honesty about environmental futures over false optimism. Academic environmental philosophy has begun systematic engagement with Thacker's metaphysical pessimism, recognizing that addressing ecological crisis requires frameworks capable of acknowledging reality's fundamental resistance to human meaning-making rather than perpetuating anthropocentric assumptions about environmental governance and social coordination. The integrative implications of Thacker's ecological relevance extend beyond environmental discourse toward broader questions about how philosophy can address contemporary challenges that exceed traditional disciplinary boundaries. His work demonstrates how aesthetic and literary approaches to philosophical problems can provide frameworks for understanding social phenomena that resist conventional analytical methods, particularly when confronting experiences that overwhelm rational processing and require alternative modes of conceptualization. The growing influence of horror aesthetics in climate communication suggests that ecological discourse increasingly recognizes the inadequacy of purely rational or scientific approaches when addressing populations confronting genuine existential threat from environmental collapse. This development points toward future integration of philosophical pessimism with practical environmental action, suggesting that effective responses to ecological crisis may require acknowledging rather than overcoming the horror inherent in confronting planetary-scale processes. Thacker's framework provides sophisticated vocabulary for articulating experiences that otherwise remain unarticulated within conventional environmental discourse, potentially enabling more nuanced approaches to climate communication that neither dismiss environmental anxiety as pathology nor perpetrate false optimism about human capacity to control environmental outcomes. Thacker's theories achieve particular resonance in digital culture because network technologies routinely expose mediations beyond human comprehension, creating systematic disruptions that reveal underlying non-human processes operating through technological systems. Digital platforms, algorithmic processes, and networked infrastructures frequently manifest phenomena that exceed their design parameters, producing outputs and behaviors that resist human interpretation while maintaining operational functionality. These digital encounters with the unhuman operate through technological systems that appear to develop autonomous logics, creating experiences of technological alienation where human users confront processes that function according to incomprehensible patterns. Understanding these digital manifestations of cosmic pessimism reveals how contemporary technological environments systematically reproduce the fundamental incomprehension that Thacker identifies as central to horror philosophy, though now through screens and networks rather than cosmic spaces. Thacker defines digital horror as disruptions in technological systems that expose underlying non-human processes through glitches, anomalies, and autonomous algorithmic behaviors that exceed their programmed parameters. This phenomenon operates through what he characterizes as technological opacity, where the mediation between human intention and digital output becomes so complex that the processes themselves appear to develop autonomous agency. The unhuman within digital environments manifests when systems produce results that resist interpretation while maintaining functional coherence, creating what Thacker terms algorithmic non-humanities, processes that operate according to logics that cannot be fully comprehended or controlled by their human creators. These digital encounters with the unhuman function through technological systems that appear to develop their own temporalities, spatialities, and causal patterns that exceed human cognitive frameworks. Digital horror operates through specific technological mechanisms, including machine learning systems, producing outputs that exceed their original programming parameters, algorithmic trading systems triggering market behaviors through emergent logics, and social media platforms generating behavioral patterns that develop autonomously through user interaction. These systems demonstrate operational mechanisms where technological processes appear to function independently of conscious control, producing what Thacker identifies as the digital sublime, experiences where technological complexity exceeds human comprehension while maintaining operational functionality. Contemporary examples include artificial intelligence systems whose decision-making processes resist human interpretation, cryptocurrency networks operating through mathematical principles incomprehensible to users, and Internet of Things devices developing autonomous communication patterns. Each manifestation exposes how digital technologies routinely create experiences of the unhuman through their operational complexity and emergent behaviors. Contemporary digital culture manifests these themes through widespread concerns about artificial intelligence, unpredictability, deepfake media generating fabricated content that appears authentic, and data processing systems operating with opacity that prevents meaningful human oversight or comprehension. Algorithmic bias in hiring, lending, and criminal justice demonstrates how technological systems develop autonomous decision-making patterns that exceed human ethical frameworks, while cryptocurrency networks and blockchain technologies function according to mathematical logics that resist human interpretation. Social media platforms generate behavioral patterns through algorithmic interaction that produces unanticipated outcomes, while machine learning systems produce creative content that appears meaningful to humans while remaining fundamentally opaque in their generation processes. These technological phenomena collectively demonstrate how digital environments routinely reproduce the experiences of cosmic incomprehension that Thacker identifies as central to horror philosophy. Understanding Thacker's framework for digital horror provides crucial insight into the evolving relationship between humans and technology, revealing how contemporary digital culture systematically reproduces encounters with the unhuman through technological mediation. This analysis illuminates how digital platforms and algorithmic systems create experiences of technological alienation that parallel cosmic horror's confrontation with fundamental incomprehension, though now manifesting through screens and networks rather than cosmic spaces. Recognizing digital horror as a legitimate philosophical category enables more nuanced engagement with contemporary technological challenges while maintaining critical awareness of the limits of human technological control and comprehension. Thacker's insights thus demonstrate how horror philosophy remains relevant for understanding the most pressing technological and cultural developments of the digital age. Eugene Thacker's philosophical system achieves its most profound significance not through individual concepts, but through their convergence into a unified understanding of human knowledge's fundamental limitations. Through his development of cosmic pessimism, the distinction between world and world without us, horror as philosophical method, and the recognition of unhuman forces, Thacker constructs what might be called an architecture of ignorance, an intellectual framework that systematically maps the boundaries of human comprehension while simultaneously revealing what lies beyond those boundaries. This synthesis represents philosophy's mature recognition that its greatest insight may be the acknowledgement of its own limits, particularly when confronting phenomena that resist all attempts at human meaning-making. The theoretical coherence of Thacker's system emerges through three interconnected developments that reinforce each other: linguistic failure as demonstrated through negative theology and apophatic approaches, metaphysical pessimism as articulated through encounters with catastrophe and horror, and ecological insight through the recognition of planetary processes operating beyond human timescales. These elements function as mutually reinforcing components of a single philosophical arc that begins with human meaning-making attempts and concludes with the recognition of their fundamental inadequacy when confronting cosmic-scale processes. His engagement with speculative realism provides the systematic framework for this integration, while his occult philosophy background supplies the historical precedents for approaching reality through the lens of revealed limitations rather than accumulated knowledge. The operational mechanisms of this synthesis become visible through contemporary applications where multiple aspects of Thacker's philosophy manifest simultaneously. Climate change demonstrates world without us dynamics through environmental processes operating on geological timescales. Algorithmic systems reveal linguistic failure through decision-making processes that exceed human comprehension. And global pandemics exhibit horror as philosophical method through encounters with biological processes indifferent to social structures. These contemporary phenomena function not as isolated examples, but as interconnected manifestations of the same underlying tensions that Thacker's system articulates, specifically the recognition that human systems of meaning and control perpetually encounter realities that operate according to logics fundamentally incompatible with human interpretive frameworks. Contemporary global anxieties across political, scientific, and cultural domains reflect the systematic tensions that Thacker's philosophical system anticipates and explains. Financial market instability caused by algorithmic trading systems mirrors his concepts of dark media and unhuman forces operating through human-created technological infrastructures. Climate governance failures demonstrate his insights about planetary horror and the inadequacy of political frameworks when confronting environmental changes exceeding human planning horizons. The proliferation of conspiracy narratives and dark media engagement represents popular recognition of the same linguistic and epistemological limits that Thacker identifies through his philosophical analysis of horror and catastrophe. These phenomena reveal not random cultural developments, but systematic responses to encounters with reality that consistently exceed human meaning-making capacities. Understanding Thacker's synthesis provides a comprehensive redefinition of philosophy's role in an age of global instability, suggesting that philosophy's primary function may not be knowledge acquisition, but rather the cultivation of appropriate responses to knowledge's inevitable limitations. His system offers tools for navigating contemporary challenges, not through false promises of technological or political solutions, but through the philosophical recognition that some problems require acknowledgement of their fundamental insolubility within human frameworks. This represents a mature philosophical position that neither retreats into cynicism nor advances naive optimism, but instead develops what might be called philosophical resilience. the capacity to function effectively while maintaining clear recognition of the cosmic forces and processes that perpetually exceed human control. Thacker's horror philosophy thus achieves its ultimate synthesis by transforming the apparent failure of human meaning-making into an opportunity for developing more appropriate forms of wisdom about humanity's place within larger planetary and cosmic contexts. Thacker's concluding philosophical insight represents perhaps his most mature and practical contribution to contemporary thought. The recognition that philosophy must learn to live with, rather than master, the world without us. This stance emerges from his comprehensive investigation of cosmic pessimism, negative theology, and the limits of human knowledge that we have explored throughout this journey. Where traditional philosophy has often sought complete comprehension and total mastery of reality, Thacker advocates for intellectual humility in the face of cosmic indifference and the fundamental limits of comprehension that define human existence. This represents not a failure of philosophy, but its proper recognition of its own scope and limitations within the broader context of existence that exceeds all human understanding. The theoretical framework for living with the world without us draws upon Thacker's synthesis of negative theology, metaphysical nihilism, and cosmic horror. This approach operates through what he terms reflective acceptance of uncertainty and systematic relinquishment of human-centered expectations about reality. Rather than attempting to resolve the fundamental tensions between human meaning-making and cosmic indifference, this stance embraces these tensions as productive sources of philosophical insight. It acknowledges that the unhuman world operates according to logics, timescales, and processes that exceed human comprehension, while simultaneously recognizing that this incomprehension does not invalidate human existence, but rather defines its proper relationship to the cosmos. This framework rejects both naive optimism and absolute despair, instead offering a middle path of philosophical sophistication that can acknowledge cosmic indifference without succumbing to nihilistic paralysis. The operational mechanisms of this stance function through several interconnected processes that Thacker identifies as characteristic of mature philosophical engagement with cosmic reality. First, it operates through systematic recognition of epistemic limits, acknowledging where human knowledge ends and cosmic mystery begins, without using this as an excuse for intellectual laziness. Second, it functions through what Thacker calls productive uncertainty, using the recognition of unknowing as a source of philosophical creativity rather than frustration. Third, it operates through temporal humility, recognizing that human timescales and concerns exist within much larger cosmic processes that operate according to their own imperatives. These mechanisms work together to create a form of philosophical practice that can engage seriously with cosmic reality without falling into either hubristic mastery or paralyzing despair. Instead, finding wisdom in the recognition of proper limits and appropriate humility. Contemporary life increasingly requires this perspective as global systems grow more complex, interconnected, and unpredictable in ways that exceed traditional frameworks of understanding and control. Climate change exemplifies this necessity, demonstrating planetary processes operating on geological timescales that resist human planning horizons while simultaneously creating urgent existential challenges for human civilization. Artificial intelligence systems develop decision-making processes that exceed their original programming parameters, creating technological phenomena whose implications extend beyond human comprehension or control. Financial markets exhibit emergent behaviors through algorithmic trading that produce economic consequences governed by logics their human creators cannot fully understand. Global pandemics reveal biological processes operating according to epidemiological realities that resist political coordination while simultaneously transforming human social structures. These examples demonstrate that Thacker's call for learning to live with the world without us is not merely philosophical abstraction, but practical necessity for navigating contemporary reality, where human institutions and meaning-making systems encounter systematic limitations. The integrative implications of Thacker's concluding insight offer a final understanding of his contribution to contemporary philosophy. An invitation to think alongside the unhuman while acknowledging human finitude without falling into either false transcendence or nihilistic despair. This synthesis reveals that his entire philosophical project, spanning cosmic pessimism, horror as method, the limits of language, and metaphysical nihilism, ultimately aims to create space for a form of philosophical practice sophisticated enough to engage honestly with cosmic reality while remaining rooted in human experience and limitations. It represents not an ending of philosophy, but its proper beginning as a mature discipline that can acknowledge both the extraordinary scope of human intellectual achievements and the equally extraordinary extent of cosmic reality that exceeds all such achievements. This synthesis offers contemporary thought a framework for intellectual honesty about human limitations combined with philosophical creativity in the face of cosmic mystery, providing finally a way of living intellectually with the world without us that honors both human dignity and cosmic indifference.